I've never been good at monogamy. It's not that I don't love the people I'm with. I do. At least I think I do. But staying faithful? It's always been difficult for me. Like an itch I couldn't stop scratching. When David proposed to me after 2 years of dating, I said yes without hesitation. I wanted to be his wife. I wanted to build a life with him. I thought that maybe marriage would be the thing that finally grounded me, that stopped the part of me that always seemed to sabotage my relationships. But there was one thing standing in the way of that dream. Keith. Keith was David's best friend, his brother from another mother, as David would always say. The two of them had been inseparable since college. Keith was charismatic, quick-witted, and had a way of making everyone around him feel at ease. He was the kind of guy who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with a dozen new friends. I knew Keith before I even met David. I'd been to a party with some mutual friends, and Keith had been there. He had this magnetic energy, the kind that pulled people toward him without him even trying. He made me laugh. His jokes always sharp but never cruel, and when his attention turned to me, I felt like the only person in the room. That night, we flirted. It was harmless, or so I told myself. But there was an undeniable spark between us, the kind that made my heart race and my cheeks flush. Nothing happened that night, but I remember lying awake afterward, thinking about the way he smiled at me. When I met David a few months later and learned he was Keith's best friend, I shoved that memory to the back of my mind. David was everything Keith wasn't. Steady, reliable, and deeply kind. He made me feel safe, like I could finally build a life with someone who would never let me down. For a while, everything was fine. Keith was just David's best friend, a part of our social circle I saw now and then. But then, about a year into my relationship with David, things started to shift. It started innocently enough. Keith and I began texting more frequently, usually about David. He'd ask for my advice on what to get David for his birthday, or enlist my help in planning a surprise party. I told myself there was nothing wrong with our conversations. They were about David, after all. But then the conversations began to drift. He'd text me late at night, joking about something he'd seen on TV, or sharing a funny story about work. I started looking forward to those messages. The way they made me laugh. The way they made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I don't know exactly when things crossed the line, but one night, while David was out of town for work, Keith and I ended up alone together. He'd stopped by to drop off something David had left at his place, and I invited him in for a drink. We sat on the couch, talking and laughing, the way we always did. But there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before, a charge that made my skin tingle. At some point, the conversation turned more serious. Keith opened up about his struggles with relationships, how he always felt like he was chasing something he couldn't define. I told him I felt the same way, like there was a part of me that was never satisfied, no matter how good things were. "Susan," he said softly, his eyes locking on mine. "You're incredible, you know that?" I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but he didn't look away. "I mean it," he said. "David is the luckiest guy in the world to have you." Something about the way he said it made my breath catch. Before I knew it, he was leaning in and I wasn't pulling away. His lips brushed mine, tentative at first and then more urgent. It felt like a dam breaking. All the tension, all the unspoken feelings we'd been dancing around for months came rushing out in that moment. After that night, I told myself it was a one-time mistake, that it wouldn't happen again. But it did. Again and again. Being with Keith was thrilling in a way I couldn't explain. He made me feel alive, like I was the center of the universe when I was with him. When he looked at me, it was with an intensity that made my pulse race. With David, everything was steady, predictable. He loved me unconditionally, and I loved him for it. But with Keith, there was an edge, a danger that made every moment electric. We kept our affair a secret, meeting in hidden corners, exchanging stolen glances at parties. Every time I was with him, I felt a mix of exhilaration and guilt, like I was walking a tightrope and daring myself to fall. Keith would say things that made my heart flutter and ache at the same time. "You make me crazy, Susan," he'd whisper, his lips brushing against my ear. "I know this is wrong, but I can't stay away from you." I knew it couldn't last, that it would all come crashing down eventually. But for over a year, I let myself get swept up in the thrill of it all, even as the guilt ate away at me every single day. The morning of my wedding felt like a dream. My bridesmaids were bustling around, making sure everything was perfect, while I sat in front of the mirror trying to calm the nerves that churned in my stomach. I wasn't nervous about marrying David. I loved him. Or at least I thought I did. But the weight of my secrets felt heavier than ever. I had told Keith the night before that our affair had to end. Once I married David, I was going to be a different person. I would leave my old habits behind and commit myself fully to him. Keith had nodded, his expression unreadable, and I thought that was the end of it. But then, as I was getting ready, Keith showed up. He knocked on the door of my dressing room, and when I opened it, he held out a small box. "You left this at my apartment," he said, his voice low. It was a bracelet David had given me for our anniversary. I'd worn it during one of my last encounters with Keith, and in my haste to leave, I must have left it behind. I reached out to take it from him, but he didn't let go right away. "Susan," he said, his eyes searching mine. "Are you sure you want to do this?" "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're about to marry David," he said. "If you're not ready to give this up, then maybe you shouldn't go through with it." I knew what he was saying, and for a brief moment I hesitated. But then I pushed the thought away. "It's over, Keith," I said firmly. "This has to be the last time we see each other like this." But as we stood there, inches apart, something in the air shifted. The tension between us was unbearable, and before I knew it, his lips were on mine. I don't know how it happened, but one moment we were standing in my dressing room, and the next we were tangled in each other's arms. I told myself it was just one last time, that it didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. When it was over, Keith left without a word, and I sat there, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My hair and makeup were flawless, my wedding dress pristine. On the outside, I looked like a bride ready to walk down the aisle. But inside, I was a mess. I told myself that what Keith and I had just done didn't change anything. I would marry David, and I would spend the rest of my life making it up to him. He didn't need to know. No one did. But secrets have a way of coming to light, and mine was no exception. The ceremony went off without a hitch. David stood at the altar, waiting for me with tears in his eyes. And when I walked down the aisle toward him, I could see nothing but pure love on his face. It nearly broke me. For a brief moment, I told myself that this was it, that this was the fresh start I needed. I would be the wife he deserved from this moment forward. I said my vows, my voice trembling as I promised to love and cherish him for the rest of my life. When David slid the ring onto my finger, his hands steady and sure, I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly made me gasp. I pushed the feeling down, determined not to let it ruin this day. The reception was beautiful, a celebration filled with joy and laughter. Friends and family gathered around us, congratulating us, toasting to our future. But even amidst the festivities, I couldn't shake the weight of what had happened just hours earlier. Keith was there, of course, as David's best man. He looked as calm and composed as ever, but I noticed the way he avoided my gaze. He laughed and joked with the other groomsmen, but there was an edge to his smile, a tightness in his jaw that only I could see. I tried to keep my distance from him, terrified that someone would pick up on the tension between us. But the guilt was unbearable. Every time I looked at David, saw the way he beamed at me, the weight on my chest grew heavier. For a while, everything seemed fine. David and I danced together, his hands warm and steady on my waist as he spun me around the dance floor. I clung to him, trying to lose myself in the moment, to forget what I had done. But later that night, I noticed a shift. David and Keith were standing near the bar, their conversation looking anything but friendly. I watched, frozen, as David leaned in, his body tense, his expression dark. Keith's face had gone pale, and he was gesturing with his hands as if trying to explain something. Then it happened. David's fist shot out, landing squarely on Keith's jaw with a sickening crack. The sound was loud enough to cut through the music and chatter of the reception, and heads turned in their direction. Keith stumbled back, clutching his face, his eyes wide with shock. "You son of a bitch," David shouted, his voice raw with anger. "What the hell, man?" Keith sputter, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. "You know damn well what," David yelled, stepping forward as if to hit him again. "You slept with her, didn't you? On our wedding day, Keith? You slept with my wife." Gasps rippled through the crowd as David's words rang out, and the room fell into a stunned silence. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the scene unfold, unable to move, unable to speak. Keith tried to say something, but David didn't let him get a word in. "How could you do this to me?" David demanded, his voice shaking with fury. "I trusted you. You were supposed to be my best friend." Keith raised his hands in a placating gesture, his voice frantic. "David, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen." "Don't you dare," David roared. By now, a few of David's friends had stepped in, grabbing his arms to hold him back as he struggled against them, his rage boiling over. "Let me go," he shouted. "I'm not done with him." "David, stop," one of the groomsmen said, his voice strained as he tried to hold David back. "This isn't the place." Keith, still clutching his jaw, took a cautious step back. He glanced around, his eyes darting nervously over the crowd of onlookers. He looked like he wanted to disappear. "I'm sorry," he mumbled again, but his voice was weak and he couldn't meet David's eyes. "Sorry?" David spat. "You're sorry? You think that fixes this? You think that fixes what you've done?" It took 3 people to pull David away and calm him down enough to stop him from lunging at Keith again. Meanwhile, I stood frozen in place, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. As they dragged David back, his eyes finally landed on me. The fury in his gaze was replaced by something even worse. Hurt. Betrayal. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low but firm, his eyes locked onto mine. The crowd was still buzzing with shock, people whispering and staring, but I barely noticed them. All I could focus on was David and the storm in his eyes. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "Outside," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I followed him out onto the terrace, my legs trembling beneath me. The cool night air did nothing to ease the burning shame that consumed me. David stopped and turned to face me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Did you sleep with Keith today?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My entire body went cold, and I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stammered, my mind racing for an explanation, a way out, anything that could undo the damage. "Don't," he said, holding up a hand to stop me. His voice was calm, but his eyes were filled with so much pain that it took my breath away. "Don't lie to me, Susan. Just tell me the truth." I opened my mouth to deny it, to say anything that would make this moment go away, but the look in his eyes told me he already knew. Lying would only make it worse. Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded, my voice trembling. "Yes," I whispered. "I'm so sorry, David. It was a mistake. I love you, I do." "Stop," he said, cutting me off. He shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Just stop." The silence that followed was suffocating. I wanted to reach for him, to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but I couldn't move. David's eyes searched mine for a long moment, as if he were trying to find something. An answer, a reason. Anything that would make sense of what I had done. Finally, he let out a shaky breath and looked away. I can't do this, he said, his voice barely audible. David, please, I begged, my voice breaking. It didn't mean anything. I made a mistake, but I love you. Please don't let this ruin everything. He turned back to me, his eyes hard. Ruin everything? Susan, you slept with my best friend on our wedding day. Do you even hear yourself? His words cut through me like a knife, and I could feel the tears streaming down my face. I didn't mean for it to happen, I said, my voice desperate. I'm sorry. I'll do anything to fix this. Anything to make it right. There's nothing to fix, he said quietly. You made your choice. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in my wedding dress, my world crumbling around me. Inside the reception hall, the laughter and music continued, a cruel reminder of the life I had just destroyed. The next morning, David handed me an envelope. Inside were divorce papers. I can't do this, he said, his voice hollow. You betrayed me, Susan. You betrayed us. I begged him to reconsider, to give me another chance, but he wouldn't listen. It's over, he said. And Keith? He's not my friend anymore. He's dead to me. As I watched him walk out the door, I realized I had lost everything. My husband, my best friend, and the life I had been trying to build. Looking back, I don't know why I did the things I did. I loved David, but I couldn't seem to stop myself from ruining everything good in my life. Maybe Keith was right. Maybe I wasn't ready to get married. Or maybe I was just too broken to make things work with anyone. All I know is that I'll carry the weight of my choices for the rest of my life. David deserved better, and I'll never forgive myself for not being the woman he thought I was.